Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're heading into the heart of the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
Oh, yeah, a pivotal time for sure.
Definitely. And we're focusing on this podcast episode we found fascinating: Ghetto frustration and the rise of militant activism in the 1960s.
Ooh, that sounds like it gets right to the heart of the matter.
It really does. And we know you, our listeners, are super interested in this period, especially how the movement kind of shifted gears in those northern ghettos.
It's such a crucial piece of the story, isn't it? You have these huge legal victories happening, like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Major milestones for sure.
But then you look at the reality for Black Americans living in those ghettos, and it's a completely different picture.
Yeah, it's almost like this massive disconnect, right? Like on one side, you have celebrations and progress.
Right.
And on the other side, it's still crushing poverty, police brutality, this whole system that just seems stacked against them.
It's like the legal barriers are coming down in the South, but folks in the North are still trapped in this cycle of hardship.
It's no wonder there was this growing sense of frustration.
Totally understandable. The podcast really captures this with some personal stories. Like, there's this one account from a woman in Chicago.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
She talks about how the police would just harass her teenage son just for walking down the street.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And it just drives home the point that these weren't just like abstract legal battles. It was about survival, about dignity, just the basic right to exist without fear.
Absolutely. And it's not like the traditional civil rights organizations weren't trying, right? I mean, you had groups like the SCLC, CORE, the NAACP, even the National Urban League. They were all active in the North.
They were, but their efforts often came up short.
Why do you think that was?
Well, take the NAACP, for example. They were incredible at legal battles, right? Like dismantling segregation through the courts. That was their strength.
For sure.
But the podcast points out that their strength, that focus on litigation, also became a limitation when it came to the immediate needs of those living in the ghettos.
So they're winning these legal victories, but
the day-to-day reality of things like police brutality, the economic inequality, the terrible living conditions, those things weren't changing fast enough.
right, those are issues you can't always solve just by winning in court.
Exactly. And that's where CORE came in, trying to bridge that gap between legal victories and actual tangible change.
They were the ones with the freedom houses, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Those were like hubs within Black communities, providing services, education, job training, healthcare, all sorts of things.
Sounds like a much more hands-on approach.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But even they face challenges. You know, the podcast talks about constant struggles with funding, and then there were tensions within the movement itself.
It seems like there were always obstacles.
Always. And then you have Martin Luther King Jr. trying to shift the movement's focus towards economic justice with the Poor People's Campaign.
That was a bold move for sure.
It was, but according to the podcast, it didn't always land well with Northern activists. Some felt it was out of touch with their immediate needs.
I can see that it's hard to think about long-term goals when you're struggling just to get by.
Exactly. And it highlights this difference in perspective, right? The Southern model of the movement, focused on dismantling legal segregation, didn't always translate smoothly to the realities of the North.
It's like they were speaking different languages.
In a way, they were. And all of this created this perfect storm for figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael to step in.
They offered a different path, didn't they?
They did, and a more radical one, a much more immediate response to that deep frustration simmering in the ghettos.
And their message really resonated with people, didn't it? Especially those who felt like they'd been ignored or even betrayed by the slow pace of change.
Absolutely. Malcolm X, especially with his powerful words and his rejection of King's nonviolence, became a symbol of resistance for those who felt like self-defense and immediate action were necessary just to survive.
There's that famous quote of his, right? You don't stick a knife in a man's back 9 inches and then pull it out 6 inches and say you're making progress.
Powerful, isn't it?
It really is. It's not just words. It's this visceral image that captures the urgency of the moment.
And he wasn't alone. Stokely Carmichael, with his call for Black power, tapped into that same energy.
That was about so much more than just desegregation, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was about Black pride, self-determination, economic autonomy, a complete redefinition of the movement.
So we're seeing this clear shift happening. The old ways aren't working, and these new, more radical voices are emerging.
And it's crucial to understand this shift if you really want to grasp the full complexity of the civil rights movement.
Like, we're starting to see the pieces of this puzzle come together, right? The legal victories, the persistent inequalities, the limitations of those traditional organizations, and then the rise of these new, more radical voices.
Exactly. It's all connected. And it leads to this really important question. What were the consequences of this shift towards militancy?
Yeah, did it alienate potential allies? Did it spark a backlash? Or did it force people to finally confront the systemic inequalities that had been ignored for so long?
Big questions, and we'll definitely dive into those as we continue.
Definitely. But first, I think it's worth taking a closer look at how those traditional civil rights organizations tried to tackle the specific challenges of the northern ghettos.
Sounds like a plan. Let's do it. You know, it's really interesting to see how all these organizations, each with their own unique approach, were trying to navigate this just incredibly complex landscape of social change.
It was a lot to handle, for sure.
It was. The podcast does a great job breaking down their efforts. You know, what really stands out to me is this constant tension between their successes and their limitations.
Yeah, like they were making progress, but
Exactly.
it wasn't enough.
Not nearly enough.
Let's start with the NAACP. I mean, they're practically synonymous with those big legal battles, right?
Absolutely. Brown v. Board, the Civil Rights Act, they were instrumental in all of that.
Hugely influential. But the podcast also makes this crucial point, that their strength, that laser focus on the courts, it also became a bit of a limitation when it came to the immediate needs of people living in those northern ghettos.
Because legal victories,
They don't always
translate to immediate change on the ground, do they?
Right. So you're dismantling segregation on paper, but the daily realities of police brutality, the economic inequality, those awful living conditions, they just persisted.
Exactly. And that's where CORE stepped in.
It was a different approach.
Right. They were trying to bridge that gap, you know, between those legal wins and actual tangible change for people.
But the freedom houses.
Exactly. Those freedom houses were designed to be like these hubs within Black communities.
Providing those essential services directly, right?
Exactly. Education, job training, healthcare, all those things that the legal battles couldn't quite reach.
So it was more of a hands-on, direct approach.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But even their efforts, you know, they faced a ton of challenges.
Podcast mentioned that, right?
Yeah, they were constantly dealing with limited resources.
Which makes sense.
And then there were all these tensions within the movement itself, you know, different factions with different ideas about the best way forward.
It's almost like they were trying to build something with one hand tied behind their back.
It really was. It makes you wonder what they could have achieved with, you know, with proper support.
A good question.
And then you have Martin Luther King Jr., right? After all those huge wins in the South.
He shifts focus.
He tries to, at least. He sets his sights on economic justice with the Poor People's Campaign.
Ambitious, for sure.
It was. It was this recognition that real equality, true equality, couldn't be achieved without tackling those root causes of poverty and economic disparity.
Makes sense.
But according to the podcast, that campaign, especially in cities like Chicago, it ran into some resistance.
From other activists.
Yeah, some northern activists felt like it was out of sync with their immediate needs. Like, imagine being told to focus on long-term economic goals when you're dealing with police harassment every day or you're struggling to put food on the table.
It's a tough sell.
It really is. And it highlights this, like, this fundamental difference in perspective, you know?
Between North and South.
Exactly. The Southern model of the movement, that laser focus on dismantling legal segregation, it didn't always translate smoothly to the unique challenges of the North.
It's like they were fighting different battles.
They were, in a way. And then you have the National Urban League, the NUL.
They were already working on the economic empowerment angle, right?
They were. They seemed to really get the need for jobs, housing, education. They were all about promoting self-sufficiency and economic advancement within Black communities.
Sounds promising.
It did. But even their efforts faced roadblocks.
Like what?
The podcast specifically mentions this lack of government support, which is super telling.
Yeah, because
it's one thing to acknowledge a problem, right? It's another thing entirely to actually dedicate the resources to fix it.
actions speak louder than words, as they say.
Exactly. And that lack of follow-through, that lack of real commitment, it speaks volumes about the systemic challenges they were up against.
It's like a pattern, isn't it? All these organizations, different approaches, different goals, different strengths, but they're all hitting this same wall.
This deeply embedded system of inequality that just wouldn't budge.
And that's the kind of environment that breeds frustration.
Oh, absolutely. It breeds anger, it breeds disillusionment.
And a desire for more drastic action.
Exactly. Imagine witnessing all these organizations, even with the best of intentions, they're struggling to create any real meaningful change.
It's disheartening.
It is, and it's no wonder that people started looking for alternatives.
Alternatives that promised faster results.
Right. And that's where figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael come in.
With a totally different energy.
They weren't afraid to shake things up.
Not at all.
To challenge the status quo, to call out the limitations of those traditional approaches.
And to demand more radical action.
They tapped into this well of frustration, this feeling of being unheard, of being unseen.
And their message resonated.
Oh, it resonated big time, especially with younger activists.
Malcolm X, he was such a powerful speaker, wasn't he?
Oh, incredible. So articulate, so unapologetically Black.
He really rejected that idea of integration as the ultimate goal, didn't he?
He did. He put the focus on Black pride, self-defense, self-reliance.
Remember that quote from the podcast?
Yeah.
You don't stick a knife in a man's back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches and say you're making progress.
Chills. Every time.
It's so powerful, so visceral.
It captures that feeling of urgency perfectly, you know?
Like enough is enough.
Exactly. He wasn't interested in incrementalism. He wanted to dismantle the entire system of oppression.
And Stokely Carmichael with his Black power message.
He took that idea and ran with it, didn't he?
He wasn't just talking about legal equality anymore. He's talking about true empowerment.
Absolutely. Black self-determination, building independent institutions, controlling their own destiny.
Creating a future where they didn't have to rely on anyone else.
Exactly. And that message, it resonated far beyond the ghettos, you know?
It really challenged the narrative.
It did. It forced everyone to reconsider what true equality really meant.
It's a powerful concept.
It is, but of course not everyone was on board with this shift towards militancy, right?
There were definitely some critics.
Oh, yeah. A lot of folks within the civil rights movement itself, they saw it as a dangerous turn.
They thought it would lead to violence.
They worried about alienating potential allies, provoking a backlash, maybe even undoing some of the progress they'd made.
That's a valid concern.
It is. It's a dilemma that we still see today in all sorts of social movements, right? How do you push for radical change without alienating those who could be on your side?
It's a tough balance to strike.
It really is. But what's important, I think, is to understand the context, the historical context, the different perspectives at play, and the long-term impact of all of this.
Because these debates, these struggles...
They're not just ancient history, are they?
Not at all.
They're still relevant today.
The ideas of Black power, self-determination, economic empowerment.
They're all still shaping the conversation around racial justice.
In a big way.
They are. And they remind us that this fight for equality, it's ongoing.
It's never really over.
Nope. It requires constant vigilance, constant questioning, constant pushing for something better.
So much to think about.
There is. And as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I keep coming back to this question. Did that shift towards militancy ultimately help or hurt the civil rights movement?
It's a big one.
It is. Did it lead to more violence? Or did it finally force those in power to address those systemic inequalities?
It's complicated for sure.
It is. But it's a question worth wrestling with.
So we've been talking about this rise of militant activism, and it's clear that it wasn't some, simple good versus bad situation.
Definitely not. It was so much more nuanced than that.
The podcast does a really good job, I think, of showing that nuance.
It really does. You really get a sense of what it was like to be living in those ghettos, you know.
Facing those daily realities.
Exactly. The kind of stuff that legal victories alone couldn't fix.
Right. Imagine seeing these headlines about desegregation, about voting rights, all this progress being made.
Yeah.
But then you step outside your door and nothing's really changed.
The same struggles, the same fear.
Same lack of opportunity.
It makes you start to question if the system can ever truly change.
And I think that's where the appeal of figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael really comes in.
They were speaking to that frustration, weren't they?
Directly.
They understood that anger, that feeling of being ignored, betrayed. Even...
Malcolm X especially. Yeah. He just had this way of cutting through all the noise.
He was fearless, wasn't he?
He was. Remember that quote from the podcast? You don't stick a knife in a man's back 9 inches and then pull it out 6 inches and say you're making progress.
Ugh, gives me chills every time I hear it.
It's such a powerful image, and it just perfectly sums up that feeling that Like, gradual change just wasn't enough anymore.
People were tired of waiting.
Exactly. They were tired of empty promises.
Tired of seeing their lives, their communities, held back by a system that just didn't seem to care.
And Stokely Carmichael, with that whole Black Power concept.
He took things even further.
Didn't he?
He did. It wasn't just about legal equality. It was about taking control.
About self-reliance.
Building their own institutions, their own communities, controlling their own destiny.
Creating a future where they didn't have to rely on anyone else's goodwill.
Exactly. It was a powerful message, and it really resonated.
It's far beyond the ghettos, even.
It did. It really forced everyone to confront these questions about what true equality actually meant.
Challenging the status quo.
Oh, absolutely. But of course, not everyone was thrilled with this move towards militancy.
It was definitely controversial.
There were a lot of people, even within the civil rights movement itself, who were worried about the potential consequences.
They thought it would lead to violence.
That was a big concern, yeah. And alienating potential allies, provoking a backlash, maybe even undoing some of the progress that had been made.
It's a valid concern.
It is. It's a question that, honestly, I think we're still grappling with today.
In all sorts of movements.
Yeah. How do you push for radical change without pushing away the people who could help you achieve it?
It's a balancing act.
It really is. But I think what's important is to understand the historical context, to see all the different sides of the story, to look at the long-term impact.
Because these debates...
They didn't just disappear, did they?
Not at all.
These questions, these struggles.
They're still with us.
They are. The ideas of Black power, self-determination, economic empowerment, they're still shaping the conversation around racial justice today.
Big time.
And they remind us that the fight for equality, it's not some event in the past, you know?
It's ongoing.
It's a process, and it requires us to stay engaged, to keep learning, keep questioning.
Keep pushing.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's the key takeaway, isn't it?
Understanding the past to better navigate the present.
Exactly. By learning from the struggles and the triumphs of those who came before us, we can better equip ourselves to face the challenges of today.
And hopefully build a more just and equitable world.
I hope so. And you know what?
What?
This is just the beginning.
It is. There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn.
So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, keep those conversations going.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.